Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many countries on which we're meeting today and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I'm speaking from the lands of the Greater Kulin Nation, and I recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to First Nations elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations people joining us here today. So my name is Justine Clark. I'm a director and co-founder of Parlour, and I'd like to welcome you to the 7th Parlour Lab session. We're delighted also with this session to welcome Amanda Achmadi and Rebecca McLaughlin as new co-hosts for the series. They'll be joining Carly in convening the series, identifying topic speakers and hosting. And so today we're very pleased that Amanda is here to host with Carly. We'd also like to thank and recognise Macarena de la Vega de Leon for her extraordinary work and commitment in getting this series up and running with Carly. Maca is now in Spain and the time difference is just too great for her to be here with us. And as I said, today Amanda is joining us as a co-host. Amanda is a senior lecturer in architectural design at the University of Melbourne, and she brings a focus on Asian architecture and urbanism. She's very smart and very funny, so we're very pleased to have her here. Here I am going off script. So I'd like to hand over to Carly now to kick off today's event. And
thanks, Justine. Hello, everyone. So lovely to be here with you all today. You probably all know me by now. I'm an associate lecturer at the University of Queensland here in Meanjin or Brisbane. Thanks everyone for joining us to discuss architecture in multicultural communities. Australia as a colonial nation, migrant architecture has existed and evolved throughout the history of Australian society, and it's yet to really be integrated into the more dominant national narrative. So in other words, sometimes people who don't see Australia as a multicultural society, they can have negative reactions to kind of ethnic looking buildings in Australian cities. So we really wanted to talk about this today and talk about the architecture of multicultural communities. And we've brought two amazing researchers who speak to different scales and building types to join the discussion today. So we're so excited to be joined by Kelum Palipane, whose research focuses on the neighbourhood scale and public spaces, and Maram Shaweesh, whose research focuses on housing. So before we hear from Kelum and Maram, let me introduce you to them. So our second speaker today is Maram Shawich. She is a PhD candidate and a friend and colleague of mine at the University of Queensland School of Architecture. Her research investigates the residential experience of the Lebanese community in Australian dwellings. Her study explores the overlap between the social, religious and cultural needs of the Lebanese community members in their dwellings and how they navigate Australia's lack of housing diversity. Our first speaker today is Dr. Kelum Palapane. Kelum is a lecturer in architectural design at the University of Melbourne. Kelum's research and teaching investigates how multimodal mapping and creative ethnographic methods can inform design in demographically complex urban conditions. Her PhD by Creative Works involved developing a design framework that would help retain and foster the diverse placemaking practices of multicultural communities, particularly in neighbourhood regeneration projects. So both Kelum and Maram talk about the possibility of Australia celebrating a vibrant multicultural architectural and social fabric open to anyone and everyone. And I think this is such a wonderful goal, and I'm really excited to learn today about how architecture can play a role in that. So I'd now like to invite Kelum to share her screen. Kelum will be speaking about a sense of place, habits of citizenry, and how cultural diversity can inform design. Thanks for joining us, Kelum.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the lovely introduction as well. It's great to be here with you today. So I'm going to meander through some of my recent research and get to the theme of today's talk at the end of it. So I'll just start with what do I do. And so as Callie said, I consider how, very simply put, I look at placemaking practices of multicultural communities, mostly here in Melbourne, to see how that knowledge can inform design. if I look at how, if you want to know how I do that, the title of the talk gives a hint of that in terms of the sense of place. So I look at, my PhD work looked at developing a framework of analysis or an expanded mode of site analysis that considers the sensory rhythms associated with how people occupy space and how that fluctuates with time. And I use immersive observational techniques drawn from ethnography to supplement these identified rhythms. So I take photographs, I do video recordings, I record senscapes, I write notes and do sketches highlighting how bodies interact with space. And I also record personal impressions and insights and participate with others in embodied activities like eating and walking, sitting and talking as opportunities arise. There's also behavior tracing and anthropological tracking. This involves observing traces of behavior patterns left as evidence in the built environment. So for example, a study I did in Footscray at the time, I saw that there are faint footprints on the blade walls of the Footscray train station. And just play a video, bit of a sound file. Later in the day, I realized that young kids arrive at the station forecourt and in the evenings to meet their friends. And while they wait, they appropriate the handrail, wall surface and ground plane during their conversation and leave behind the footprints as evidence of them occupying that space. So the significance of this type of multimodal analysis of place is that it's able to provide a framework through which we can analyze the interplay between the physical, cultural, and social of everyday life. And more importantly, for us as spatial designers, it materializes and spatializes it in a way that we can use as well. But over time, it became increasingly evident that the phenomena that I was looking at were practices that were brought over from elsewhere and enacted in a new context here in Melbourne. So I suspected I didn't have the conceptual tools or even the vocabulary to analyze what I was seeing. So I started to look at countries of origin, and that took me to Petta in Sri Lanka. Here in Petta, which is a very intensely diverse commercial district in Colombo, I used the same methods and identified a number of socio-spatial markers that allowed a group of people to survive in a very uneven and culturally complex public sphere. So what I noticed was a sort of a graded spatial sequence between the public and the private, which is where informal sellers occupy steps and niches of existing shops and buildings, and it accommodates multiple scales of commerce. And the formal shops sell more higher end goods, and the informal sellers who are selling complementary goods, but cheaper ones, are found in proximity to them, more in the realm of the more in the public realm. I also saw the ephemeral or temporal use of space supported by props. And if you can understand my drawings here, it shows that in the morning, there is almost nothing here, and goods are unloaded from small vehicles and stands are brought in from shops and arcades where they've been stored overnight. And some of these props are then used to extend the boundary, forming a new edge to the street where now the sellers can occupy. There's also multiple layers of mobility that we see. So I talked about the permanent and the temporary, but there are this wholly mobile set of sellers who use push bikes and hand carts for high maneuverability. And they usually carry perishable goods, so things that have to be made and consumed that day, and things like snacks and fruits and tea and things like that. And these mobile vendors respond to the fluctuating urban rhythms that are linked to things like the opening and closing of school and office hours, and the sort of demographic shifts that happen with that in the space, and also to the weather conditions. If it's a particularly hot time of the year, they sell cooler drinks and things like that. So it's very responsive to the conditions in space. So this sort of captures that sort of complexity. Very abruptly, I'll bring you to Eaton Mall here in Melbourne, which has been my focus in most recently. And we selected this as a pilot study because we saw it as a successful example of multicultural integration, where spatial layouts adopt a kind of open street plaza that's familiar in Mediterranean cities. And there's a slow, extended occupation of space by older men more in the mornings, when they move from table to table, group to group, and occupy this space over a long period of time. And this shifts throughout the day. So by evening, it pivots and opens up to people coming from outside to consume those kind of a culturally specific cuisine and things like that. So there is this sort of, and we can see how the layouts of the mall and the design of the space support a very intricate network between patrons of these shops, the shop owners, as well as staff who often are new migrants, and in a way that the commercial is very much coupled with the social. Okay, so why does this all matter? Why does it matter? So on one hand, the point of view of users, these spaces are important to new migrants as they support unprogrammed placemaking practices that are important for adjusting to new societies. But on the other hand, from the point of view of designers, it expands our conceptual understanding and the possibilities of space and how it can be used. So it opens up a whole new range of possibilities for critiquing and even reconceptualizing fundamental assumptions we make about architecture. So for example, if you take threshold, which in architecture means a contact between two different spatial conditions, the socio-spatial reconceptualizing could see it as performative. So if I can drag you back to Petter, at the front of shops, people leave footwear, take off their footwear at the entrance, and often water mixed with turmeric is sprinkled in front of the shop entrances, and incense is used in front of the shops in the morning. So there is no hard threshold, but a sense of threshold is signified and performed. If we look at then facade, the idea of facade, which is typically a surface that that divides public and private realms. If we think of that as reconceptualize that through a socio-spatial lens, we see that we can think of it as an extended spatial sequence that accommodates different scales of commerce and trade, and supports informal networks. So it's not just this one flat surface. So going back to the theme of the talk today about living together and how we can invite and support connections amongst and across cultures, I say that we want to shift beyond the sort of symbolic references to culture, like we see in the design of gateways and patterns and the use of words and things to represent culture, and actually look at the spatial underpinnings of difference and how that can sort of broaden our scope of how we see space can be used. And I think this can then recalibrate or sharpen our sensibilities and offer other ways of relating to each other and our spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelum. Oh, I could listen to you talk to those drawings for for hours, I think. They were beautiful. Thank you so much. We'll now hand over to Maram. I'll invite you to share your screen. Maram will be talking about the challenges and opportunities of housing multicultural Australia today. So welcome, Maram.
Thank you again for inviting me to speak today. So for those who missed the introduction, my name is Maram Shaweesh and I'm a PhD student at the University of Queensland. So my research basically looks on how the Australian Lebanese community experience housing in the Australian suburbs. So it's just another branch of studying suburbia and the suburban house from the perspective of an Australian Lebanese. So I just want to reflect on something. When I started my research, I was actually looking at place and culture in a more broader scale, so something similar to what Kelum was doing. And then as I was investigating culture more and how that is expressed, I found that the house or the home, let's say, embeds a significant portion of what culture means to the individual. So I have then started to look into housing more in depth. So I'm looking at how every aspect of culture, the challenges, the opportunities that the community have fit within a, let's say, the scale of a suburb and a suburban house. So culture is not just about thinking differently or having, we're just different in a way of what we want, but it's, let's say, a set of practices. So there's an umbrella of what culture means in terms of practices. So the meaning of family is different, how we cook is different, the way we raise our children might be different. Social interactions happen at different, maybe frequency, the need for it is different. Sense of community is also different from, let's say, from one culture to another, and that compared to the mainstream society. And how people interact within the house is different, and even the relationship with the mainstream society is different. So we know that from one migrant community to another, how they relate to the mainstream Australian society it's going to be different. So, so the first thing that I found that I got wrong before studying housing, and the reason I got that wrong is based on me reading about housing and ethnic communities, is there's a stereotype of dealing with ethnic minorities as if it's something that has just happened. So we suddenly found that there's so many cultures that we need to accommodate, but then the reality is different. Like Australia has always been a multicultural society. Cultural diversity is embedded on the way suburb functions or housing needs are. So it's not something that we're just adjusting to. And I think this is the first thing that I would like people to change in their perceptions about housing in multicultural Australia. So we're not accommodating minorities, they're just part of the society. Just like we're saying that Australians are young and old, young or old, or children, the same way. We have it's just another type of diversity. If I want to just make it simple when it comes to housing and the migrant communities, how do we perceive them not just as something that just happened, but they are actually part of the community? We stop looking at them as if they just consume housing, but they also produce it. So we have housing produced by multicultural community. So that happens as if, let's say, people renovate the houses, they knock down, rebuild houses that meet their needs. They interact with the houses. So we know that they have experience with housing in Australia. So we know how they experience the Australian house. So the second part is when housing is delivered to them. So they do not take part in producing or experiencing the houses. So let's say we've got mass housing delivered to them, also in the context of social housing and so on. Now dealing with the housing produced by multicultural community, as practitioners, it's kind of easier because you know the client, they will tell you what they need, you'll do your best to cater for them. But for the majority of us, we would be actually dealing with that kind of housing, which is why we should reconsider how we approach, let's say, ethnic minorities in Australia. So what my research does is I look at how housing produced, experienced, and let's say consumed by the Australian Lebanese families. And I try to interpret that into housing needs, or even considering this as just another variety of what a suburban house might be. Because it's not like they're always waiting to be accommodated, but they also produce, and then they leave something in our suburbs that we start to notice. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to show you examples of the themes that I'm investigating in my research. So one of the themes that I found that it's very significant on how they change the urban fabric and how they consume housing is accommodating multi-generational families. So this is an example of a family that purchased the land in 1982. And as the family grew, children got married, they had children, and so on. They eventually now have 19 family members living on this complex. So they're all related, living there. So this is a way of changing the urban fabric. Another thing that I look at is how people within the house respond to changes. So children grow, they get married, they have children, they move out or they move in with their partners. And even the transition from childhood to adulthood, what they need is going to be different. The transition from you being a mother with young children or a mother with teenagers is also different. So I also try to map how people respond to these changes. So in terms of sleeping arrangement, changing the use of the house, and so on. Another thing is how privacy is accommodated. So privacy to the Lebanese community is very important. So how do they respond to that? How do they change the space in order to accommodate this and achieve maximum satisfaction? And how parenting values also interact with the house. So one example is multiple families chose to homeschool their children. And I think so many families have experienced that already during the COVID pandemic. So if you want to do this permanently, you know that at least the house has to be adjusted. Otherwise, you just can't do it. And they actually do their best to do that because the mother has to work, but also has to teach the children. And you have multiple children at different ages with different needs. So for example, in this area, this is a homeschooling area, which is placed between the kitchen and the living area. So the mother can observe the kids while she does housework and they study. This is also a homeschooling area that's been placed in the kitchen because it didn't have anywhere else in the house. Another thing I look at is even as simple as cooking. So it's not just different flavors, but then how much space do you need to cook? How much heat do you generate? How much ventilation do you need? Is very different. So people started to build multiple kitchens. So you now go and you find many people who have multiple kitchens, even when it's a nuclear family, because this is convenient. You want to keep the indoor clean, but you also might be struggling with ventilation, and very simple details make them do changes. And then this is one of the examples, which is a knockdown rebuilt house. So they purchased the land, they knocked down the old house, and they built a new one. They accommodated 2 kitchens, a granny flat for the in-laws, and then that house is going to be there for too long. And then they start to see that many people adapt, or let's say adopt these changes to cater for the needs as well. Also, the significance of backyards as cultural sites. So culture is expressed in the backyard, and this is very well documented in, let's say, the backyard of the Lebanese migrant community, as well as the, let's say, Italian migrants, Macedonian migrants, and so on. And I think this is very important to keep reflecting on because the Australian house is now changing. The house is going bigger, but the backyard is going smaller. This is not always ideal. So we always have to think, does that really work with everyone? So just to sum up, I want to give you examples of how people can start to think of housing differently. So the first thing we can think of is who lives in the house. So maybe we can broaden our perspective of the family to think of a multi-generational family or larger nuclear families. The children's needs, what do children need in the house? So it's not just a bedroom for them to sleep, but then what can they do in the house? And that is changing over time. And then privacy needs, like what does it mean? What is a privacy beyond just assigning a bedroom for every adult? But then within the social spaces, how do we access backyards? How do we enter the house? How do we leave the house? It's all important. So something like as simple as delivering a variety of where do you enter the house and where do you leave the house, and what can you see from the living room and what you shouldn't be seeing from the living room. Diversity in that does not really cost you much. So we're not talking about delivering something that, oh, well, it's out of control. No, it's sometimes just simple adjustments can actually make a difference. And then also think about the people who don't live in the house. So for the Lebanese families, there's a significance on hospitality. So I've got families that they have 50 family members coming in every 2 to 3 weeks for barbecues. And then they make adjustments in the house, permanent adjustments, to make sure that this happens without feeling discomfort, either for the guests or for the occupants. And that's also actually emerging from the relationship with the mainstream society. So they feel that they need this continued family-oriented lifestyle to take place. But then family to them isn't just mother, father, and children. It's a lot more extended than that. And so one of the things that may actually be challenging is Australia. There's so many cultures that live in Australia. So if you want to cater for everyone, especially that you don't know who's going to live in the house, that might be putting people off delivering diversity. So my opinion is that it's not about delivering specific houses that meet specific needs. It's more about delivering housing that could accommodate a variety of needs. So how much control that occupants have to change the use of the space, to open it up, to close it down if they want to create separation or to make it a joint space. So this is, in my opinion, what diversity should be, is that within this enclosed space, you're catering to so many people instead of creating culturally specific prototypes to cater for minorities, let's say. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kelum and Maram. That's such a fascinating presentation. And I think through your very like a sensitive observation, we see an example of how we can approach diversity without falling into the trap of essentializing difference. Because both of you identify the social spatial dimension of otherness. And I think we learned so much from your very, very detailed and nuanced analysis, how this is actually everyday life practice. And there's so much to understand and learn from, multiculturalism without, relying on symbolism. And I think we have a couple of questions that I hope can kickstart a discussion. And already one from the audience, but I might want to start with a more general one, and for both of you. And when we realize more that Australia, we're living in a multicultural society, what do you think is the first a couple of approach that we need to do as a practitioners to realize that our design is situated in a multicultural context? How might practitioner need to adapt their design process to allow us to kind of expand our language, expand our imagination?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is, while we design, we assume that multicultural people will be using the space rather than it may or may not happen. It most probably will happen. So considering that, I think would make a difference. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Mara. Maybe Kelum?
Yeah, I think just being aware that, multiculturalism is usually thought of as, when we think of it, it's vernacular architecture, or it's, if you think of global south, you think of informal urbanism and slums and informal settlements and things. So it's not, there's something beyond that. There are kind of spatial underpinnings to all that, which can educate us, actually. So kind of actually taking the first step to acknowledge that there's so much we can learn from these things is I think a first step. And also acknowledging that we have a very, I think particularly here, a very narrow scope of understanding how space can be used. And that's kind of reinforced by legislation, planning policy, all these things. And just, I know these are big level, higher level thinking, but just kind of acknowledging those two things, that we have a existing very narrow scope of use for our spaces, and then also we have a lot to learn from these other ways of being and using space in other cultures. Those are kind of two things, and that can be then things like site analysis processes can come into our design kind of repertoire, and those things can come with that if we sort of acknowledge that in the beginning.
Yeah, and then I think the key point is that the way space is used in the global south, urban space is always very intense, right? There's multiple use, because space is quite contested in the way that you have to compete to operate, and I think that's the opportunity to learn of this much diverse possibility of better utilizing urban space, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it has implications for Australia still, because we are heading towards a more complex, uneven, especially public sphere, where we get, where the dismantling of the White Australia policy, and we're starting to see very diverse populations migrating here, no longer from those traditional backgrounds, and we have to start acknowledging that in how we design our spaces.
And I think I would like to kind of invite Maram to expand a little bit of that notion, I think the experience of multi-generational living, because I think that is another facet that we can learn from migrant household. And like now we have a shift in many cities in Australia of multi-generational living, because housing becomes so unaffordable for the younger generation. And I think maybe if you can highlight a couple of things of lessons learned from the fact that migrant households are so used of multi-generational living.
Yeah, so the thing is, now there's a lot of recent research focusing on this shift, as you said. It's because of housing affordability. More people are choosing to live, to continue living with their parents after they become adults and so on. And for the Lebanese community, it's a combination. It's not just culture. It's also responding to issues facing them as Australians too. So they also can't afford to move out sometimes. Sometimes it's not working out, but they have to stay. And then, the difference is that they have been doing this for long enough. So the Lebanese community specifically has been in Australia for too long. So we're talking about 3 migration waves. Some of them have been, the first migration wave took place during the 1880s. Second one in 1948 after the Arab-Israeli War, and the third one was after the Lebanese Civil War. So they came to Australia, and they already have had challenges, but then they now live in Australia for too long that we stopped, let's say, overcoming challenges facing them as migrants, but they're actually overcoming challenges facing them as Australians living in Australia for too long. Now, this means that living in multi-generational houses is not just about culture, but actually responding to these issues. And this is going to face them as well as many other Australians. So what I do in my research is I try to break down what even a multi-generational house mean. So it's not just about adult children not affording to move out. Specifically in this case, they're not to move out until they get married, but then them getting married and not affording to move out. So how do they respond to that? And this, when it comes to how do you actually separate the, let's say, the everyday life of family one and the everyday life of family two. Once they get married and have children, it's family two, without actually making these clash. And many people respond by building granny flats. So enabling them to do that would actually solve a lot of problems and in terms of accessing housing and housing affordability. And I met actually with an Australian Lebanese man. He's a drafter, and he says, "Oh, everyone wants me to help them build a granny flat, and I've got ready designs. They just come in and they pick because I know that's going to work with them, and they just go and try to fit it on the side." It's that efficient as a community. That's how efficient they are, because many of them work in the building industry. Many of them have been let's say responding to these challenges for too long. So I think just maybe even finding what doesn't work as living in a multi-generational family is, and then how can we make it? And I think in the housing industry, they are starting to respond to this. So if you go to the, let's say, the bigger developing companies, you'll find that there are housing models that are to cater for dual living, but then that's a lot more expensive than accommodating a nuclear family. And then if the whole idea of dual living is to overcome the challenges, then you'd start to think, does that actually work or doesn't work? So yeah, I think looking at legislation, how do you enable people to actually accommodate this? If they can do it comfortably, then it's less likely for them to struggle and then try to escape the struggle, and then they will go again in the loop of not finding affordable housing and so on. So it's both things that we can learn from them, that what the challenges that have faced them, and how others made it work. So like in the case of the knockdown rebuild, so from the beginning, they know that we're going to be living as multi-generational families. Now we accommodate the in-laws, but in the future, we're going to accommodate our children. So we build it now before it gets more expensive. And then how did they separate those daily practices without invading the privacy of anyone in the house?
Right. Thank you, Maram. And we have a question from the audience. I would like to invite Sue, maybe to ask directly to our speakers.
Thank you. What a delightful session. First, though, I've got about a dozen questions that have come off the top of my head after listening to those two fantastic presentations and hearing the discussion. So congratulations to everyone for thinking so carefully. But I'll go back to that one I put on notice, and it was picking up on the idea of ethnographic research and ethnographic methodologies. So one comment, there is a global community of practice called EPIC, and EPIC stands for the Ethnographic Practice in Industry Conference, which convenes annually with the most extraordinary range of papers and sessions, which I've dived into the last couple of years. And I think it's very rich and very fertile ground for briefing and for analysis, where you want to bring fresh eyes to a problem and the techniques, and there's a mountain of material there. So I loved seeing the way you were recording it, Kelum. And I wanted to ask, picking up on your point is of once we have this insight, well, what do we do with it and how do we use it? When you showed the Eaton Mall diagrams, I wonder, was that commissioned, and is Eaton Mall looking to make some changes to that facade zone or the urban guidelines of that part of the street so that it is more responsible in the future? So how is it being used?
Thanks for the comments and questions, Sue. I think firstly, it wasn't commissioned by the council at all. We identified it as a spot that was a kind of exemplary case study where we saw how the actual development of the mall, from what we understand, happened with a lot of input from the community in around 2008, I think. So they were able to bring in some of their culturally specific ways of socializing into the design of that mall. So we were looking at it as a case study rather than, as a way of critiquing the mall. But from that, I don't think I would have suggestions how to make things different, but there are, funnily enough, when you kind of occupy that space and analyze it, you start to understand the internal differences that and diversity within those groups. So it was quite a gendered use of space in the mornings. So there's no overt exclusions of women, but we see how kind of traditional gender roles play out as well. So how the men sit around and meet in the morning, but the women take their shopping trolleys and go off to the market and come back afterwards. So there's this whole different sort of nuances of these things come in, and I don't know whether as designers we can address those things in a kind of whether we should address those things. So the whole kind of set of questions that come up with that, specific to Eaton Mall. But then you're thinking, the question you brought up of what can we do with knowledge like this. So as it goes back to the question of expanding our, diversifying our use of space. And if I bring an example of Footscray and look at it in terms of a typology of a train station, the Footscray train station, and in those where those kids were hanging out, and they are so they come and meet there, and it's a very important part of their daily or weekly routines. So actually meeting face to face and congregating in that way. But there's also a lot of media that happens around not vilifying, but seeing their kind of gathering as some, almost a threatening thing. Well, what can we do as designers in that situation is where, okay, train stations are designed to be efficient and move people through them very quickly. But what if you think about design spaces for lingering, accommodating those the socializing of those kids, and we're able to then quickly shift the perception of that, and then we no longer see them as, there's a kind of threatening a group as a threatening group, but something as a vital part of our social fabric and part of our urban social fabric. So I think that's the sort of, we have a role as designers in doing that, and it all comes back to that, diversifying that our space use.
And in a sense, this relates to what Maram, your study on housing associated with migrant communities, and the fact that usually there's not enough private space in the house, which means that most of the younger generation, they have to occupy public space more than perhaps the youth or the younger generation of other household without migrant background. So in a sense that those social space have to kind of occupy public space, and then we need to recognize that in designing public space in suburbs where there's a lot of presence of newly arriving migrants and of families with international backgrounds. I think that's I think very, very important observation that comes from your studies. And Sue, maybe you have a follow-up questions that you might want to ask.
Oh, I had a follow-up thought in the paper this and in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning. There was a report about how people experience casual racism in their environment every day and the long-term effects of casual racism, and it talked about the experience of Indigenous people living in Surrey Hills, so a very white Australian neighbourhood creating an everyday threat for people because of casual racism. So if people can't come to respect and understand and accommodate each other in the public realm, then where the bloody hell is it going to happen? So it's so important.
Thank you, Sue. And maybe other member of the audience might want to ask questions. We still have a time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I think
before we
Carly's
wrap up.
got some questions.
Yes, I think so.
I can jump in.
So.
Kelum, I was wondering, and just kind of adding on to that, and then maybe Maram, you can jump in with your thoughts. Are there spaces that you think, or rather than kind of changing design, or are there particular spaces that would invite interaction? So you were talking about allowing for these kind of lingering and things for people to do in groups, but have you seen any spaces that actually allow people to come together across cultures and interact with each other? And do we need a different kind of public space or different spaces within the neighborhood for that to happen?
Good. That's a good question. It seems to have happened organically in some spots. For example, Lygon Street in Carlton. That's a really, I think, good example of how initially, how when kind of Italian and Greek migrants came, there's this backlash of, them hanging outside shops, it was perceived as a negative. But then over time, Australian society adopted that, and it became part of a repertoire of how we use space. And people now come together in this sort of al fresco dining outside, meeting each other over, a long period of time over food and, drink. So it became an example of how, our practices changed. So it's really hard to sort of pinpoint guidelines in this way. It's more of, and it's very place specific, user specific as well. So it's really hard to say, do this, and this, and it'll all happen. But I feel like when we're approaching a design or redevelopment, regeneration, we need to look at the existing spatial practices and what sort of potentials they offer. I don't know whether I answered the question, but it's really hard to kind of really outline clear guidelines.
Yeah, and I guess it will be different in every community,
exactly,
right? Depending on who's there. But sorry.
As Amanda was saying, some people socialize in private spaces, others in public space, and that's very culturally specific as well, as Maram was saying as well. So it's a nuanced discussion you have to have.
And there are things like food that really do bring people together, that you can really celebrate different cultures through that, like the example that you gave. Maram, did any examples like that come up in your research? Or I thought actually the idea of the gardens was really beautiful, and that in a previous lecture that I've heard you give, you talked about residents actually growing very specific plants, and I wondered if they ever did that in community gardens or shared that across their neighborhoods or suburbs.
Well, not really. So they all try to be able to do that within our space where we can control things. But the interesting thing is that, so I was reading research on how housing in Australia has changed, the sense of community has changed, and then that the relationship between neighbours is declining overall. Like let's say in a mainstream Australia. In the Lebanese Australian Lebanese case, it's completely the opposite. So, for example, I have 2 adjacent houses. So one family is Lebanese, the family next door is Palestinian, and they have a very close relationship. So the wall between the 2 houses at the backyard is very, very high with extra extension, so they can't see each other's backyards. And then at the front, it's very, very low, so the 2 neighbors actually in the morning have coffee over the fence. So they try to negotiate how we interact, let's say, with the neighbor. So there is a, let's say, kind of a desire maintaining this relationship with the neighbors, but let's say the physical space doesn't really encourage you to do that. but they could do it. So they've agreed on doing those changes. And yeah, so the two neighbors every morning, they wake up over the fence at the front yard to interact and so on. And then if they don't want to see each other, they don't have to. They, of course, visit each other's backyards a lot and so on. But when they wanted to, not simply stepping out in your backyard, then you can see your neighbor. But there is this desire of maintaining a relationship with a neighbor. This is one thing. The other thing is that in many cases, your neighbor might be actually your relative. So you want to be able to communicate with them, but you also want to be able not to communicate if you don't want to. So you'll see there's a lot of modification simply on the enclosure of the house. We're not talking about just the house, but enclosure of the front and the backyard. What do we want to see from the other side? What we don't want them to see, and so on. So I think maybe also considering that neighbors don't necessarily not want to communicate with each other, maybe they want to, but then how could that happen? In not just simply by going to the park, but then we're talking about next door neighbors. Then how could spaces be rethought in a way that promote this to happen without actually preventing each individual from having control if they want to. So you give them control, but also that doesn't mean to prevent interaction between the neighbors.
And that really actually overlaps with Kelum's research about thresholds and having that kind of extra space there and that ability to control that space and who you interact with. And I think often when we've got these big setbacks for cars and garages, you lose a lot of that ability to interact on the street. And something that I know in my neighborhood personally, a lot of my friends and a lot of people living on my street are from Brazil, and they really miss the kind of street life that you get in a lot of South American countries, and the tensions that arise when we have tried to have events on the street is enormous, you know, where some neighbors just don't want any kind of, they don't want anything other than, you know, transport happening on the street. I was wondering, Maram, did you find that in your research? Do any of your participants kind of extend the use of their house onto the street?
So you find that garages are not necessarily garages, but they have to build the garage because then the legislation or what you can do in terms of setback and so on is different. And then they turn that into living areas. So a garage is usually, you can access it directly from the street. You don't have to go through the house. And then many of the men turn those garages into living spaces where they can host their other friends over without entering the house. So the idea of offering a living space that is kind of not in the house, but you have control over that, but then it has a stronger relationship with the street is something I think is appreciated. So I think this is the way that they interact with the street is, hosting friends in the driveway, and not having to invade the privacy of anyone inside the house.
And did that come up in your research at all, Kelum? Did people start in an Australian context taking over that street space, or were they really blocked from doing that because of our different kind of legislation?
Yeah, so that was very evident in Footscray, the studies in Footscray, where the pavement areas were often appropriated by shopkeepers because the internal spaces are not really, the shops themselves are not geared for the way goods are displayed and things like that. So people just completely take over this, the front of their shops. They sometimes appropriate the kind of, if there's a bus stand across, they even use the bus stand as a place where they can put their, goods and displays. So, and this is a point of contention in the council where they, there's issues of accessibility. How do you negotiate your way through all these things, and safety and all these issues that kind of these people kind of their head against. And it comes with, that's the thing, it's about changing your sensibilities. These people come with an idea of, blurred boundaries between public and private space, different ways of, often with kind of rural agrarian backgrounds where you don't have, clear demarcations of property lines and things like that. So people kind of naturally, interact. So it comes to a head in these sort of scenarios. But it's just that it's a very important part of for example, in Footscray, the atmosphere of it and the experience of it. So some understanding of, why this happens and how it can contribute to a vibrant kind of urban landscape is important. And I think something we need to foster.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone loves streets like that. They're fantastic places to be. We have one more question from the audience, but unfortunately we don't have time. I feel like we could just stay here forever. It would be wonderful, but we can't. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers the final wrap-up question. I might go to Maram first and then to Kelum second. Really quickly, what is a key takeaway that you'd like to leave practitioners in the audience with from your research? We'll go to Maram first.
Yeah, so I think maybe start thinking of ethnic diversity to be using the houses as the norm rather than a special case that may or may not happen. It most probably will happen. And then start to think, how do we cater for this diversity by learning more about what different people might need. Yeah, I think this is what.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maram. Kelum?
Along those lines as well, be prepared to kind of recalibrate your sensibilities and, and be prepared to be open to these new ways, other ways of, using space and conceptualizing space, and all the other methods and things will come with that.
Fantastic. So learn from what's already happening and stop being so controlling.
Yeah, in short.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you very
Kelum
much,
and Maram.
Thanks.
So that's all we have time for today. Thank you to the University of Queensland and Sahans for supporting Parlour Lab, and thanks to all of Parlour's partners for support of our activities and events. Thank you for Maram and Kelum for sharing your research with us today, and thank you to our amazing audience for being here and participating in the discussion. The recording from this Parlour Lab will be online in a week or two, so we'll send you all an email when it's up. And as always, please be in touch if you have any comments or suggestions for topics you'd like to hear about. And thank you so much to Amanda for being my amazing co-host and awesome questions and being here to bounce ideas off. I really appreciate you joining the team. And thank you, Justine, yay, for supporting us and for everything that you do for Parlour and our community.
And thank you to Melbourne Uni for the Zoom.
Yeah.
the other partner who supports this session. So,
thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time. When you said, Maram, ethnic minorities are not being accommodated by society, they are society, I was
exactly.
like, oh, of course,
because
yes.
So
absolutely.
I don't know if you remember Carly at some point in my mid-can, I was like, oh my God, this doesn't work. because I was like, so if you look at migrants housing, it's overwhelming about, oh, we're new to the society, we don't know what you're doing. And then I went and I studied the Lebanese people, and I was like, oh my goodness, they're more Australian than, there's something significant. It's an Australian Lebanese, it's something significant. It's not Australian only, and it's not Lebanese only, but it's a hybrid, and you can't separate them. And then they are so suburban living to them is the norm. And some of them haven't been to Lebanon in 40 years since they left, and the majority are born in Australia and they don't know much about Lebanon. And I thought, oh, what I was doing is so wrong, and everyone is studying them in the wrong way. We need to change this.
Totally.
And that Australia has, sorry.
No, you go.
Well, and that Australia has always been multicultural, despite white Australia. I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, because I mean, my background is British, but my mum was born in the UK, but nobody ever asked me, oh, where are you from?
Where are you from?
Whatever. But I'm much more of an immigrant than most other families that would be considered immigrant, you know, which is it's part of that kind of dominant narrative that is incorrect, basically.
Yeah. And the story behind the migration is like they're here to stay. It's so hard to deal with them as if it's a temporary state that's going to change. It's not going to change.
Yeah. And I think everyone wants more of that diversity in their houses and, you know, ability to live in the way that they want in the public sphere as well. So it's not like, it's just adding to our built environment and physical space, I think.